Today on the Daily Dose, the Spanish flu of 1918. Nearly everyone, at least once in their life, has experienced an infectious episode of common influenza. Flu symptoms include headaches, nausea, fever and chills, muscle ache, general malaise, and sinus congestion. Known simply as the flu, influenza is a recurrent infectious disease caused by RNA viruses of the Orthomyxoviridae family of viral pathogens. Known as Spanish flu or La Gripa, in 1918, 3 waves of H1N1 spread throughout the world at a staggering pace. The majority of those afflicted by La Gripa recovered fully, but in some patients the disease worsened to pneumonia, against which modern medicine at the time had no viable defense. Victims of this lethal stage of infection developed a bluish cast to their faces, which would ultimately turn purple or brown. Once a victim's feet turned black, death was generally only hours away. Spanish flu invaded cities across the globe in an almost random fashion, hopscotching around the world without apparent logic or predictable demographic progression. Boston, Massachusetts; Freetown in Sierra Leone; Brest, France. In San Francisco, over 3,500 pneumonia cases were admitted to area hospitals, with over 900 fatalities. Everywhere in the United States, public gatherings were banned. Schools, theaters, churches, and businesses were shut down by public decree. Nearly everyone wore face masks, yet nothing seemed to arrest the spread of influenza. Considered the greatest single most demographic shock that mankind has ever experienced, in 2 years that Spanish flu ravaged the earth, 1/5 of the world's population became infected, with an estimated mortality of 50 to 100 million lives. In one devastating year, Spanish flu killed more people than Hitler, nuclear weapons, and all worldwide terrorist attacks combined. In the end, despite frantic efforts to unlock its etiology and devise an effective cure, Spanish flu disappeared from the human landscape as quickly as it had arrived. And there you have it, the Spanish flu of 1918, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Great Pestilence. Rooted in Asia, Black Death or bubonic plague first arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered at the docks to welcome the new arrivals, only to discover that most of the mariners were dead, while others were covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Authorities immediately forced the ships to sail from port, but the Great Pestilence was injected into Europe despite the Sicilians' containment efforts. The symptoms of bubonic plague include fever and chill, severe headaches and malaise, nausea, vomiting, seizures, delirium, and death. The term bubonic derives from the ancient Greek word bubo, meaning swollen gland, or in the case of bubonic plague, swollen lymphatic glands. Buboes generally appear in the armpits and groin of their victim. According to chroniclers during the Black Death, other symptoms included petechia, or bruised purplish skin splotches on the chest, back, and neck. During the Great Pestilence, this condition became known as God's tokens, since petechiae always meant that the victim had a fatal case of the disease. Diarists also reported that victims who appeared to be on death's door from plague smelled like they were as well. Black Death was caused by the transmission of the Yersinia pestis bacteria from rats to humans, borne by the Xenopsilla cheops flea. Prior to the outbreak of plague, Europe experienced a period of torrential rains, which reduced crop yields and forced an overcrowding of fleas to hitch rides on rats, who in turn descended upon cities in search of a dwindling food supply. This tandem migration of a different sort of pestilence spelled disaster for the spread of bubonic plague. How many people died in the Great Pestilence can only be speculated, but for Europe the most widely accepted mortality stands at 1/3 of her population, or 25 million lives. In parts of Italy, England, and France, the death toll was much higher, upwards of 50 to 60%. Losses in the Middle East and North Africa also struck down 1/3 of her people, while China lost nearly half. If plague were to erupt today under the same conditions as medieval Europe, Black Death would cost the lives of well over 2 billion innocent lives. And there you have it, the Great Pestilence, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Mount Everest. After serving in World War II as a navigator for the Royal New Zealand Air Force, Edmund Hillary dedicated himself to his love of mountaineering, including the yet unachieved crown jewel of mountain climbing, a successful ascent of Mount Everest. In 1949, a long-standing route to the summit of Everest was closed by Chinese-controlled Tibet, while the Nepalese side of the mountain only allowed 1 or 2 expeditions a year. Selected by the 9th British Expedition to Everest, team leader John Hunt tapped out Hillary to join the attempt. The expedition totaled over 400 people, including 362 porters, 20 Sherpa guides, and over 10,000 pounds of gear. The expedition set up base camp in March of 1953, working up the mountain to establish their final camp at South Col at 25,900 feet. On March 26, 2 climbers attempted the final ascent until their oxygen systems failed less than 300 vertical feet from the summit. Hunt then directed Hillary and Sherpa guide Tenzing Norgay to follow where the last 2 had failed. The 2 pitched a tent at 27,900 feet on May 28th, while their 3-man support team returned down the mountain. The following morning, wearing 30-pound packs, the 2 climbers attempted the final ascent, until a 40-foot ice face approaching the summit nearly turned them back. Known today as the Hillary Step, Hillary later wrote that he noticed a crack between the rock and the snow sticking to the east face. He crawled inside and wiggled and jammed his way to the top. Tenzing followed behind him as Hillary chopped footholds for the 2 men to ascend the forbidden face. Then he saw that the ridge ahead dropped away to the north, while above him stood a snow dome. A few more whacks with his ice axe, and suddenly Hillary and Tenzing stood on the top of the world. Tenzing left chocolates at the summit as an offering to Hindu gods, while Hillary left a crucifix given to him by John Hunt. Their descent down the mountain was a treacherous one, since drifting snow had covered their tracks. When they finally made their way down to South Col, the first person they met was George Low. "Well, George," said Hillary, "we knocked the bastard off." Hillary would later go on to reach the South Pole in 1958, followed by the North Pole in 1985 in the company of Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. Hillary would be the first person to reach both poles, as well as the successful ascent of Everest. And there you have it, Edmund Hillary, the first man at the top of the world, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Born in the village of Klushino near Gazatsk, a city that would later bear his name, Yuri Gagarin flew for the Soviet Air Forces before being selected along with 5 other cosmonauts for the Soviet space program. As the Cold War and subsequent space race escalated between the United States and the USSR, Gagarin would stun the world by beating the Americans into space. On April 12, 1961, Gagarin boarded his Vostok 1 space capsule for a successful liftoff. He orbited the Earth for 108 minutes before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, ejecting from his capsule at 23,000 feet for a parachute drop safely down to Earth. Gagarin became an instant national hero and was awarded the Soviet Union's highest medal for valor. Beginning in 1962, the Soviet Union began celebrating the day of Gagarin's flight as Cosmonautics Day, which was later renamed International Day of Human Spaceflight. The flight would be his sole trip into space, although he did serve as backup crew for the ill-fated Soyuz 1 spaceflight, which ended in a fatal crash, killing his friend and fellow cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. Fearing for the life of their national hero, Soviet officials permanently banned Gagarin from further spaceflights. He died in 1968 when his MiG-15 training jet crashed near the town of Kurtsak, taking the life of Gagarin and flight instructor Vladimir Zarogin. And there you have it, Yuri Gagarin, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. In 1947, Princess Elizabeth of Great Britain married her distant cousin, Philip Mountbatten, a former prince of Greece and Denmark, who renounced his titles in order to marry the wildly popular princess. He was made Duke of Edinburgh on the eve of the wedding, while the marriage itself raised the spirits of the British people, who remained mired in economic hardship after the end of the Second World War. On February 6, 1952, while on a goodwill tour of Kenya, the couple learned that Elizabeth's father, King George VI, had died. First in line for succession to the throne, Elizabeth would become Queen of England at the tender age of 27. After 3 months of mourning following the loss of her father, on June 2, 1953, more than 1,000 dignitaries and guests attended Elizabeth's coronation at Westminster Abbey, while hundreds of millions listened on radios and for the first time in history watched the proceedings on live TV. After the ceremony, millions of rain-soaked spectators cheered the Queen and her husband as they passed along a 5-mile procession route in a gilded horse-drawn carriage. After more than 6 decades of rule, Queen Elizabeth II's popularity remains as strong as ever. She has traveled more extensively than any other British king or queen, as well as the first British monarch to visit South America and the Persian Gulf countries. Indisputably one of the wealthiest women in England, in 1992, Elizabeth agreed to pay income tax, making her the first monarch in over 1,000 years of royal lineage to do so. And there you have it, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube, or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, the sinking of the Titanic. Today on the Daily Dose, the Kon-Tiki expedition. In 1947, Norwegian adventurer and writer Thor Heyerdahl set out on a trans-Pacific passage in a balsa wood sailing raft named Kon-Tiki, sailing from South America to the Polynesian islands. Named after the Incan god Viracocha, for whom Kon-Tiki was said to be a nickname used by early Incans, Heyerdahl and 5 other explorers set sail to prove that natives from South America could well have settled Polynesia in pre-Columbian times, employing rafts similar to Kon-Tiki. At the time of the expedition, scholarly wisdom insisted that people from Southeast Asia had arrived from the west to first populate Polynesia. But Heyerdahl meant to prove them wrong. Using only materials and technologies available to South Americans at the estimated time of seaward migration, Heyerdahl would go down in history as the first person to successfully dispute the Asian Basin migration theory. Using illustrations drawn by Spanish conquistadors of Peruvian seafaring rafts of the time, Heyerdahl and his crew built Kon-Tiki in Callao, Peru. On April 28, 1947, the crew, including one Spanish-speaking green parrot, set sail from Callao on a 101-day journey covering 4,300 miles, until Kon-Tiki smashed into a reef at Raiatea Atoll near Tahiti on August 7, 1947. The mast and cabin were reduced to flotsam, but miraculously the great balsa wood logs that made up the main body of the raft held firm. The crew managed to salvage some of their equipment, including a high-frequency radio transmitter. Within hours, the world knew they were safe, as well as triumphantly successful. While a new mast was cut and rigged for the last leg push to their original planned destination, Heyerdahl's crash landing on Raiatea stands to this day as possible proof that ancient South Americans may well have been the original people to populate the Polynesian islands. And there you have it, the Kon-Tiki expedition, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the sinking of the Lusitania. Launched in 1906 by the Cunard Line, the nearly 800-foot-long ocean liner was comprised of 9 passenger decks, housing a maximum 2,198 passengers, along with 850 crew members. It would be the first ship of the Cunard Line's 4-funneled grand trio of ships, which would soon include the RMS Mauretania and the RMS Aquitania. On May 7, 1915, amidst some of the worst early combat of World War I, the RMS Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat as it made its way from Liverpool to New York City. Of the 2,000 men, women, and children aboard, 1,200 would perish after the torpedo found its mark. Arguably one of the most luxurious vessels in the age of ocean liners, the Lusitania sank in less than 18 minutes after the German torpedo struck its hull. The vessel went down in 300 feet of water, 11 miles off the southern coast of Ireland. Backlash following the sinking turned public opinion in many countries against the Huns, contributing greatly to the United States' entry into the war. Argument over whether the ship was a legitimate military target raged back and forth for many years during and after the war, as both sides made misleading claims about the ship's purpose and intent. For their part, the Germans justified categorizing the Lusitania as a naval vessel, since at the time of her sinking, the ship was carrying over 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, nearly 5,000 shrapnel shell casings, and 3,240 brass percussion fuses. The Germans further argued that the Lusitania, like many British merchant ships, routinely violated the internationally recognized cruiser rules, which forbade attacks on civilian ocean liners and non-military merchant ships. In 1982, the British indeed admitted that munitions were on board the ship, although no active weapons were aboard. As for the Germans' decision to take the lives of 1,200 innocent victims, it remains a glaring stain to their reputation as a humane and ethical nation, only to be dwarfed by the inhumanity of the Holocaust committed by the Germans in World War II. And there you have it, the sinking of the Lusitania, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the bikini swimsuit comes of age. On the 5th of July 1946, the bikini swimsuit was introduced for the first time 4 days after a successful post-war nuclear bomb test at Bikini Atoll. While there is evidence of bikini-like fashion worn by ancient civilizations, the modern two-piece swimsuit made its first appearance after the end of the Second World War. While swimsuits for women had gradually become less conservative during the first half of the 20th century, wartime fabric rationing forced designers to remove excess material, which resulted in more form-fitting and figure-enhancing swimwear that had less panels concealing a woman's body. A minimalist two-piece swimsuit was first introduced by French fashion designer Jacques Hain in May of 1946. Named the atom after the smallest particle of matter, the bottom half still covered the wearer's navel. Meanwhile, French designer Louis Réard was working on his own design, which used even less material. Réard hired exotic nude dancer Micheline Bernardin from the Casino de Paris to model his creation, since he was unable to convince any of his usual go-to models to wear it. He called a press conference at the Piscine Molitor in Paris on the 5th of July, 1946, where he stated that like the atom bomb detonated at Bikini Atoll, the bikini swimsuit was equally small and devastating. Despite wide coverage in the press, the initial reaction by the general public was one of shock and dismay. Even in the 1950s, some magazines continued to disparage the bikini, with Modern Girl magazine declaring it is inconceivable that any girl with tact and decency would ever wear such a thing. Yet despite conservative reaction from some circles, over the passing years, images of celebrities wearing bikinis eventually turned the two-piece swimsuit into a billion-dollar-a-year enterprise. And there you have it. The bikini swimsuit comes of age. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Great English Train Robbery of 1963. On August the 8th, 1963, Britain's most infamous train robbery took place on the Royal Mail train known as the Glasgow to London Travelling Post Office. The operation to steal millions of pounds of used unmarked bills was planned with precision and carried out with unparalleled daring. The thieves targeted the second carriage from the front, where valuables and cash were stored. Usually the train only carried about 300 pounds, but because it had been a bank holiday weekend in Scotland, the load had grown to around 2.3 million pounds. The overnight train left Glasgow on Wednesday night, and at 3 the next morning, driver Jack Mills had just passed Buckinghamshire when he saw a red track signal ordering him to stop the train at Sears Crossing. What Mills didn't know was that the signal had been rigged by stuffing a glove over the green light while attaching a 6-volt battery to the red. Co-driver David Whitby got out of the train to see what the problem was, soon discovering that the railway communications cable had been cut. Before he could retake the train, he was attacked, handcuffed, and thrown down an embankment. Meanwhile, one of the robbers boarded the train and knocked Jack Mills unconscious. It didn't take long for authorities to track down the gang's hideout, where they were summarily arrested after a failed attempt to flee. In 1964, 13 train robbers were sentenced to a combined 307 years in prison for carrying out Britain's most daring train robbery. But just 4 months later, Charlie Wilson broke out in an escape attempt which proved to be as daring as the robbery itself. A gang of men on the outside stole a builder's ladder to scale the wall of a mental institution positioned next door to the prison, freeing Wilson and 3 others from their cells using a stolen master key. A huge manhunt was soon underway, but it took police 3 years to track Wilson down to his hiding place in Canada. Train robber Ronnie Biggs was similarly disinclined to serve out his sentence and plotted an escape that would prove far more successful than Charlie Wilson's attempt. He fled first to Paris, then to Australia, finally landing in Brazil where he forged a new life in Rio, becoming a tourist attraction for traveling Brits. In 1999, he invited more than 100 people to his 70th birthday party. When his health failed after a series of strokes, in 2001 he returned to England, where he was sent back to prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence. Biggs was released from prison on compassionate grounds in August of 2009, passing away in a nursing home in December 2013. Train driver Jack Mills was so traumatized by the robbery that he would never work again. And there you have it, the great English train robbery of 1963, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube, or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, Hitler's Olympic Games. For 2 weeks in August 1936, athletes descended upon Berlin for the 11th Olympic Games. Visitors and athletes alike were warmly welcomed, but behind the pomp and pageantry were ominous signs of a Nazi regime gone bad. The swastika was openly displayed on banners around town and at the Olympic Stadium, while the German sense of Aryan supremacy was a hard thing to conceal. After the aggressions displayed by the Germans during World War I, Hitler and his propaganda machine used the Olympics as a way to present a kinder, gentler image to a largely skeptical world. Off the field, the truth about what the Nazis were up to was hard for foreigners to miss. By 1936, Jews and other minorities had been openly stripped of their civil rights and even their citizenship, while Jewish-owned businesses were forced to display the Star of David on their storefronts. History would later reveal that the Nazis had already opened their first concentration camp by the time the Games began. Prior to the start of the Games, debate raged in the U.S. and other participating countries about whether to attend at all. But in the end, 49 nations, including the United States, came to Germany to compete. And at the opening ceremonies, visiting athletes and spectators alike witnessed Aryan athletes follow in the footsteps of ancient Greeks, bringing fire from Mount Olympus in the first ever Olympic torch relay. Popular history remembers Jesse Owens' 4 gold medals, an Olympic first for any athlete, no doubt causing great embarrassment to the Germans' belief in their Aryan supremacy. The Games also stood as a major corruption to the ideals sacred to the Olympic Games, creating an illusion of a peaceful and tolerant nation that was the farthest thing from the truth. 3 years later, Nazi stormtroopers would blitzkrieg into Poland, setting off 6 years of war that would cost the lives of 60 million people. And there you have it, Hitler's Olympic Games, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Barbary slave trade. From 1500 to the middle of the 19th century, a brisk Caucasian slave trade prospered in slave markets along the Barbary coast of North Africa, including the Ottoman province of Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripolitania, as well as the independent Sultanate of Morocco. From bases along the Barbary coast, pirates made a habit of raiding ships traversing the Mediterranean, as well as the northern and western coast of Africa, plundering their cargo and enslaving the unfortunate people aboard. To shed light on the pervasiveness of the problem, between 1609 and 1616, England alone lost 466 merchant ships to Barbary pirates. Once the pirates realized how much money Muslim men would pay for non-Muslim women as ornaments in their harems, pirates expanded their shopping grounds to include coastal towns in Italy, Spain, France, and England, sometimes foraging as far north as the Netherlands and Iceland. Settlements such as Baltimore and Ireland were completely abandoned following one raid, not to be resettled until many years into the future. Slavery victims who had family money or wealthy friends were generally held for ransom, including the author Cervantes, who was held for almost 5 years from 1575 to 1580. Captives who converted to Islam were generally freed as a loophole, since enslavement of Muslims was strictly forbidden by Islamic law. The practice of white slavery declined after Sweden and the United States defeated the Barbary states in the Barbary Wars of 1800 to 1815. English and Dutch warships further curtailed the practice in 1816 when they delivered a punishing 9-hour bombardment of Algiers, leading to that state's eventual surrender. The last of the white slave trade ended for good after the French conquest of Algeria in 1830, but not before an approximate 1.2 million unfortunate Caucasians found themselves enslaved in Africa. And there you have it, the Barbary slave trade, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Hitler wants a wall. As early as December 1941, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler ordered that plans be drawn up for the construction of an Atlantic wall, which would ultimately set off a monumental effort to create defensive fortifications along the entirety of the west coast of Europe. Work began in the spring of 1942, and by April of the following year, almost 250,000 conscripted French laborers were at work building massive coastal fortifications, batteries, mortars, and defensive masonry walls capable of stopping or at least slowing a mechanized invasion from the sea. From the tip of Norway to the Spanish border, every beach along nearly 2,000 miles of coastline was to be made impassable. Naval guns were housed in what the Nazis believed to be indestructible bunkers, while behind the Atlantic Wall, tracks were laid for railway guns capable of hurling shells as far away as England. In the fall of 1943, Hitler became even more convinced that an Allied invasion along the Atlantic coast of Europe would soon become an inevitable reality. Known as the Desert Fox, Hitler ordered Rommel to undertake an inspection of the Atlantic Wall defenses and to prepare for what Hitler believed would be a decisive engagement between Allied and German forces. Believing also that the invasion would be launched across the Straits of Dover against the Pas-de-Calais region, Hitler ordered this sector to be given priority over other sectors of the Atlantic Wall construction project. But by mid-1944, while fortifications in and around the Pas-de-Calais region were deemed completed, other sectors were far from ready for an impending Allied invasion, particularly in and around Normandy, France. As a result of this defensive frailty, on June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy took place at 5 beachheads known as Omaha, Juno, Utah, Gold, and Sword. Supported by 6,939 naval warships and landing craft, around 156,000 Allied soldiers and paratroopers landed on D-Day, while a total of 1.5 million Allied troops would flood into Europe via the Normandy beachheads by the end of the week. 10,500 Allied troops would be killed, wounded, missing, or made prisoner of war by the end of the first day, while the Germans would suffer a nearly equal number of casualties. 10 months later, Allied troops would storm the Nazi capital of Berlin, ending 6 years of bloodshed that cost the lives of 75 million people. And there you have it. Hitler wants a wall. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the liberation of Paris. Upon word of the approach of General George Patton's Third Army towards the outskirts of Paris, the French forces of the interior, part of the French resistance, staged an uprising against the German garrison occupying the city. 7 weeks after Operation Overlord and the D-Day invasion of Normandy, on the night of August 24, 1944, elements of General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division made their way into Paris shortly before midnight. The next morning, they would be joined by the bulk of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, whereupon Wehrmacht Commander Dietrich von Choltitz surrendered to the French at the Hotel Maurice, the newly established headquarters of General Charles de Gaulle of the victorious French army. Despite scattered attempts at scorched earth and sabotage by the retreating Wehrmacht forces, when elements of the French, British, and American armies poured into the city, Parisians responded with cheers, wine, and kisses. Allied airmen flying low over the city saw little material damage, but after 4 years of German uniforms, jackboots, swastikas, and Nazi salutes, Parisians were swept away by a tidal wave of jubilation and relief. Approaching Notre Dame Cathedral by way of the Hotel de Ville, Snipers opened fire at General de Gaulle's motorcade. People in the crowds crouched down or ran for cover, while de Gaulle himself largely ignored the threat. When the snipers were put out of action, the city would see 4 straight days of celebration and parades. Vive Paris, vive de Gaulle, vive la France. And there you have it, the liberation of Paris, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, stealing Mona Lisa. Up until the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre Museum in 1911, the painting hung in relative obscurity in a backwater wing of the museum. Long known for shoddy security, it took Louvre staffers 2 days to discover that the painting was even missing, setting off a media sensation that twittered the French public and baffled the French police. Initially thought to be the work of modernist enemies against traditional art, avant-garde poet and playwright Guillaume Apollinaire was arrested and questioned for a week before being released. Pablo Picasso was next on the suspect list, but without any solid evidence, he too was set free. The now famous painting remained missing for the next 2 years, until petty thief Vincenzo Peruggia made contact with Florentine art dealer Alfredo Ghirri, offering to repatriate the painting to Italy for a reward of 500,000 lire. Calling himself Leonardo Vincenzo, Peruggia traveled to Florence by train the following month, concealing the Mona Lisa in the false bottom of a trunk. Ghirri notified police when the painting was in his possession, and when Peruggia was arrested, he insisted that he believed that Napoleon had stolen Mona Lisa during the Napoleonic Wars, and Peruggia was just doing his patriotic duty by returning Da Vinci's masterwork to its rightful homeland. After his capture and confession, authorities would learn that Peruggia, a former handyman at the Louvre, had donned a white frock worn by Louvre employees, entering the museum through an employee entrance on Monday, August 21st at 7 in the morning, walking into the still deserted Salon Carré and taking the painting into a service stairwell, where he removed Mona Lisa's protective case and frame. Wrapping the painting in his smock, he tucked it under his arm and walked out of the museum through the same employee's service entrance in which he had entered. Peruggia would serve 8 months in prison before being released. In the end, the 2-year buzz that surrounded the stolen painting solidified Mona Lisa's reputation as an archetypal masterpiece of the Italian Renaissance, making her the best known and most visited and written about painting in the world. Today, Mona Lisa attracts over 10 million visitors each and every year. And there you have it, stealing Mona Lisa. Today on the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on with the Daily Dose and learn something new every day. Subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, the Panama Canal. After successfully building the Suez Canal through Egypt, French developer Ferdinand de Lesseps began construction on the Panama Canal in 1881, until the French abandoned the effort 8 years later after 20,000 workers lost their lives to malaria. Once science had identified the Anopheles mosquito as the transmission vector of the disease, the Americans completed the Big Dig in 1914. Although the 33-year combined construction project would see 500 deaths for each mile completed of the 51-mile man-made waterway. The new shortcut around the Horn of Africa reduced transit time and nautical miles traveled from the west coast of the United States to the commercial ports of Europe by 42%, with a 14% reduction from Shanghai to New York City. During construction, 160 miles of railroad tracks were laid down at the bottom of the canal, employing 300 locomotives and 4,000 ore cars to haul away the debris. Once completed, 6 locks lowered ships 85 feet to sea level on both the Atlantic and Pacific sides of the canal, while each lock's physical size clocked in at 1,000 feet in length, 110 feet in width, and 83 feet deep. Despite the massive lock gates that weighed in at 400 to 700 tons each, the gates could be closed in just under 2 minutes. After the Americans handed ownership of the canal to Panama in 1999, the advent of larger Panamax ships made passage through the canal an incredibly tight squeeze. As a result, the Panamanian government undertook a monumental expansion project between September 2007 to May of 2016. The new set of locks on the Pacific side are called the Cocally locks, while the new set on the Atlantic side are known as the Agua Clara locks. Each new lock is 1,400 feet long by 180 feet wide by 60 feet deep, making passage for Panamax crews a far less heart-pounding experience. On average, 14,000 ships transit the canal annually, at a toll price per ship of $150,000, while total transit time through the waterway and canal comprise a passage time of 10 hours per ship. In 2019, total revenue generated by the canal for the Panamanian government rose to $2.6 billion. And there you have it, the Panama Canal, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the First Crusade. The spark that lit the First Crusade began in 1095, when Byzantine Emperor Alexios requested military support against its war with Seljuk-led Turks. After Alexios' first plea was made before the Council of Piacenza, less than a year later, Alexios would repeat his appeal before the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban threw his support behind an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem, with the goal of eradicating Muslim control over the Holy Lands. Before the Prince's Crusaders set off for the Middle East, a French priest known as Peter the Hermit led thousands of predominantly poor Christians toward Jerusalem in what would become known as the People's Crusade. Along the way, they slaughtered Jews as they made their way across Germany, receiving just payback when they were wiped out by the Turks at the Battle of Civito in October of 1096. The Prince's Crusade by members of European nobility began in the late summer of 1096, arriving in Constantinople between November 1096 and April 1097. Estimated at upwards of 100,000 troops and non-combatant support personnel, the Crusaders captured Nicaea during a naval assault, marching through Anatolia or Turkey, where they suffered starvation and disease. Despite heavy losses, they pushed on to capture Antioch in June of 1098, pressing onward to capture the crown jewel of Jerusalem on July 7, 1099. 7 more crusades would take place over the next 192 years, until the Crusaders' presence in the Holy Land began to erode when the city of Acre fell to the Mamluk Sultanate in 1291. And there you have it, the First Crusade, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, British airmen crash a Nazi party. On the 10th anniversary of Hitler's ascension to power, the British Royal Air Force sent 3 twin-engine bombers on the RAF's first-ever daylight bombing raid over Berlin, with the intention of disrupting Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring's pep talk to a war-weary German public. At 11 in the morning, when Göring was scheduled to address a parade from the Air Ministry building, 3 de Havilland Mosquito bombers, known affectionately by the Brits as the Mossy or the Wooden Wonder, flew a daring low-altitude bombing raid over central Berlin, prompting one eyewitness to later report that Göring was boiling with rage and humiliation, since the successful mission completely discredited Göring's claim to the German people that enemy aircraft would never fly over the Reich. To further the hurt, during the afternoon of the same day, 3 more Mossies from the 139th Squadron bombed Berlin's largest indoor sports arena, where Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was scheduled to address the day-long celebration of the Nazis' rise to power. Of the 6 Mossies flying over Germany that day, 105th Squadron leader D.F. Darling and his navigator William Wright were shot down near Altengrabo, Germany, taking the lives of both brave men. After the humiliating attacks, Göring would say that it makes me furious when I see the mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knocked together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again. And there you have it. British airmen crash a Nazi party. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Alice takes a trip. First published in 1865, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, now commonly shortened to Alice in Wonderland, was first conceived 3 years before publication, when Carroll and the Reverend Robinson Duckworth rode up the headwaters of the River Thames in a boat with 3 young girls, a day which Carroll remembered as the Golden Afternoon. Carroll, whose real name was Charles Dodson, was a professor of mathematics at Christ Church University at Oxford. And on that golden afternoon, Lorena, Edith, and Alice were the daughters of Christ Church University's Vice-Chancellor, Henry Liddell. The boat ride began at Folly Bridge, Oxford, and ended up 5 miles away in the Oxfordshire village of Godstow. Along the way, Carroll made up a story for the girls about a bored little girl named Alice who falls through a rabbit hole into a subterranean fantasy world populated by peculiar anthropomorphic creatures. All 3 girls became transfixed by the story, prompting Alice Liddell to ask that Carroll write it all down for her. Since its first publication, Alice in Wonderland has risen in stature to become one of the best-known and most popular works of English-language fiction. While its narrative, structure, characters, and imagery have been enormously influential in popular culture and literature, especially the fantasy genre. The work has never fallen out of print and has been translated into at least 97 languages. Character allusions are manifold, including Alice Liddell as herself, while Carroll is characterized as the dodo, because Dodson frequently stuttered when he spoke, which made him pronounce his last name as Dodo Dodson. Symbolism provides another rich landscape in the story, since most of the book's adventures may have been influenced by people, situations, and buildings in Oxford, and at Christ Church in particular. For example, the rabbit hole symbolized the actual stairs in the back of Christ Church's main hall, while a carving of a griffin and a rabbit were pulled directly from Ripon Cathedral, where Carroll's father was a canon. The book also makes many references to mathematics, which at the time of publication made the book a scathing satire on new modern mathematics that was just emerging in the mid-19th century. And there you have it. Alice takes a trip. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the resurrection of Mary Rose. Long known to be King Henry VIII's favorite warship, not to mention Britain's first warship, the Mary Rose sank in a naval engagement against the French in 1545, taking the lives of 500 ill-fated sailors, while a heartbroken Henry VIII witnessed the loss from the shoreline. First located in 1971, the wreck was finally raised 11 years later in a brilliant feat of marine archaeology. After more than 4 centuries submerged in the depths of the Solent waterway near the Isle of Wight, the Mary Rose was returned to Portsmouth, England, almost precisely to the spot where she was first constructed 500 years earlier. After her resurrection in 1982, a restoration museum was specifically built at a cost of £35 million by the Mary Rose Trust, enclosing her delicate remains at the Portsmouth dockyard, not far from Nelson's flagship HMS Victory. The ship's remains were sealed in a hotbox and sprayed with water for the next 30 years, maintained in a temperature-controlled environment of 82 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit and 90% humidity. The preservation sprayers were finally turned off on April 29, 2013, kicking off a 5-year hot air drying phase, where over 100 tons of water were extracted from the surviving timbers of the ship. A full 47 years after her discovery, the viewing gallery of the museum is now made up of 3 levels to match the original deck configuration of the warship. The nearly 20,000 artifacts found aboard the ship are displayed in near total darkness, which gives visitors a sense of the original conditions below deck when the ship was underway. For once the gun ports were shuttered, the sailors within were forced to carry out their shipboard duties in total darkness. To make the reconstruction as authentic as possible, experts molded the faces of crew members based on skulls found in the wreck, while cod and hagfish bones reflect the diet of seamen during the Tudor era. A backgammon board and dice were found in the wreckage, which reflects how sailors relaxed when not on duty, while rosary beads were also recovered during the salvage operation, despite being banned by Henry VIII when he split from the Catholic Church in 1534, after the Vatican refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And there you have it, the resurrection of Mary Rose, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube, or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, Virginia Woolf's seminal novel, Orlando. First published in October 1928, Virginia Woolf's Orlando is a high-spirited romp inspired by the tumultuous family history of the aristocratic poet, novelist, and Woolf's lesbian lover, Vita Sackville West. The book follows the adventures of a poet who changes sex from a man to a woman and lives for centuries without aging, along the way meeting key figures in English literary history. Since its publication, the book has become a feminist mainstay and has been extensively written about by scholars of women's writing and transgender studies. A member of the artistic and intellectual guild known as the Bloomsbury Group, which included fiction writer E.M. Forster and economist John Maynard Keynes, the group's combined works profoundly influenced literature, aesthetics, criticism, and economics, as well as modern attitudes toward feminism, pacifism, and sexuality. In Woolf's novel specifically, the work also satirized British culture in the sense that inversion, as lesbianism was then called, was allowed only as a fictional allegory, but never touched upon in British society if inversion was deemed real. Woolf also intended the novel as compensation for the sense of loss often felt by Sackville West when she lost her childhood home to a male cousin, simply because he was male and she was female. Scholars have further argued that the novel is about the impossibility of representing the female experience in its entirety, particularly when the observing comes from the eyes and thinking of a male perspective. And there you have it, Virginia Woolf's seminal work, Orlando, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Age of Enlightenment. Following the scientific revolution, which included the work of Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes, Galileo, Johann Kepler, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the Age of Enlightenment was a largely European intellectual and scholarly movement that spanned from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Some date the beginning of the Enlightenment to René Descartes' 1637 essay entitled Cogito ergo sum, or in English, I think, therefore I am. Others cite the publication of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica in 1686, or John Locke's essay concerning human understanding in 1689. French historians traditionally peg the dates of the beginning of the Enlightenment to the death of Louis XIV in 1715, until the start of the French Revolution in 1789, although the majority of historians affix the end of Enlightenment with the beginning of the 19th century. Known as the High Enlightenment, the high-water years of the period ran from 1730 to 1780, and was centered around the dialogues and publications of French philosophers Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Denis Diderot. Foremost among the interchange of ideas was Voltaire's notion that everything in the universe could be rationally demystified and cataloged. Philosophers and scientists during the Age of Enlightenment circulated ideas through regular meetings held at scientific academies, Masonic lodges, and literary salons, as well as in printed materials such as books, journals, and essay pamphlets. Many of the more persistent ideas undermined the authority of monarchies, which included debates on liberty, liberalism and neoclassicism, religious tolerance, constitutional government, and the separation of church and state. The period further threatened the authority of the Catholic Church when intellectuals employed scientific methodology and reductionism to question religious dogma and orthodoxy, an attitude captured best in Immanuel Kant's essay entitled Answering the Question, What is Enlightenment?, where the phrase supera aude, or dare to know, can be found. Many educated Christians of the period sought to readjust their faith along rational lines, arguing that nature, biology, and the universe appeared to determine its own course of action without God's intervention. Taken as a whole, many scholars believe that the Age of Enlightenment opened the door for the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, including those of the Americans and the French. And there you have it, the Age of Enlightenment, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. After cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, Director of Cosmonaut Training Nikolai Kakamin read in an American media source that female pilots in the U.S. were training to become astronauts. As a result, Kakamin gained approval for an all-female cosmonaut program, which began training in 1963. Born on March 6, 1937, textile worker Valentina Tereshkova had no previous desire to fly in space. However, her love of skydiving made her an excellent candidate for the Soviet space program. Training included isolation tests, centrifuge G-force tests, thermo-chamber tests, decompression chamber tests, and pilot training in MiG-15 fighter jets. On June 16, 1963, Tereshkova reached outer space in her Vostok 6 rocket after a flawless liftoff. Although she experienced nausea and physical discomfort for most of the flight, she orbited the Earth 48 times in just under 3 days, making her the first and only woman to solo in space. As was the protocol in all Vostok missions, Tereshkova ejected from her capsule during its descent at about 4 miles above the Earth, parachuting to the ground in Kazakhstan on June 19, 1963. After the dissolution of the first group of female cosmonauts in 1969, Tereshkova stayed on at the Soviet space program as an instructor, graduating from the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy and retiring from the Air Force in 1997, having attained the rank of Major General. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tereshkova was elected in 2011 to the National State Duma, much like the American House of Representatives, re-elected for a second term in 2016. And there you have it, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the rape of Nanking. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, over 20 million Chinese civilians perished due to attrition or massacres by Japanese forces. The most famous and brutal of these, which still remains an obstacle in Sino-Japanese relations to this day, was the Nanking Massacre of 1937, also known as the Rape of Nanking. After war broke out in July of 1937, by December of that same year, Japanese forces had closed in on Nanking, which at the time was the capital of the Republic of China. Chinese forces were quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese, prompting Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek to order a full retreat. Many soldiers dressed as civilians to blend in, which prompted Japanese commanding officer Prince Asaka to encourage his men to actively engage in rape, murder, torture, theft, and arson. Beginning on December 17, 1937, and lasting for 6 blood-soaked weeks, foreign journalists and other observers witnessed the wholesale gang rape and slaughter of Chinese civilians and military personnel alike. For the 2 decades leading up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, most people in Japan saw the Chinese as an inferior race, which infused a further contributory motive to the genocide at Nanking. After Japan's surrender following the Second World War, historians have been unable to accurately estimate the death toll at Nanking due to the destruction or disappearance of Japanese military records. But in 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East estimated 200,000 casualties during the 6-week rape of Nanking, while the Chinese Nanking War Crimes Tribunal of 1947 placed the death toll higher at 300,000 lives. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East further estimated that 1,000 women were gang raped each and every day of the occupation, as Japanese soldiers went door to door searching for girls. Most were killed immediately after being raped, often including gruesome mutilations of their bodies. The Reverend James M. McCallum wrote in his diary, "People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon, and evening. The whole Japanese army seems to be free to go and come as it pleases, and to do whatever it pleases." After the surrender of Japan in 1945, the principal commanding officers in charge of Japanese troops in Nanking were put on trial. General Matsui was indicted and executed for deliberately and recklessly ignoring his legal duty to prevent breaches of the Hague Convention, while Hisao Tani was tried and executed by the Nanking War Crimes Tribunal. Other commanders had died during Japan's subsequent involvement in World War II, while Prince Asaka was granted immunity from prosecution due to his status as a member of the imperial family. Isamu Chao, an aide to Asaka, and the person many historians believe issued a "kill all captives" memo to Japanese troops at Nanking, had committed ritual suicide during the Battle of Okinawa. And there you have it, the rape of Nanking. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the French sink their own navy. Following the Allies' successful invasion of French North Africa, Nazi leaders reneged on their armistice of 1940 with Vichy France, setting in motion operations Anton and Lilla with the intent of capturing French warships and submarines for use against Allied naval assets. Long before the Germans set their sights on the French fleet, British and American leaders feared such a takeover by the Nazis, obliging the British to attack the French Navy at Mer el-Kabir on July 3, 1940, followed by the Battle of Dakar on September 23 of that same year. On November 11, 1942, German and Italian troops closed in on the French coastal city of Toulon, home to the French fleet, which triggered Vichy Secretary of the Navy Admiral Gabriel Ophon to order Admirals Jean de Laborde and André Marquis to oppose the invading armies without bloodshed by means of local negotiation. If that failed, his orders went on, then the admirals were obliged to scuttle their ships in port or at sea. Long before the impending attack by the Germans and the Italians, the French Navy had strengthened Toulon's defenses against an anticipated attack by Allied forces, which included a premeditated game plan for scuttling the fleet if an Allied attack was deemed imminent. On November 27, 1942, 4 German combat groups and a motorcycle battalion entered the Greater Toulon area at 4 a.m., catching Vichy officers completely by surprise, but not before one of the officers transmitted the order to Admiral Laborde to scuttle the fleet as quickly as possible. "Scuttle, scuttle, scuttle," the order went out from Laborde's station on the battleship Strasbourg, prompting scuttling crews to set demolition charges and open sea valves on as many ships as possible. The Germans' main force got lost on the foreign roads surrounding Toulon, giving the French a full hour's head start. And when the Germans finally reached the gates of the naval base, French sentries further delayed their entry with the fabricated need for additional paperwork. In the end, of the 164 vessels in the French fleet, 77 were successfully scuttled, while 3 destroyers, 4 submarines, and 39 small ships were captured by the Germans, costing the lives of 12 French combatants and wounding 26 others. The Germans, in turn, would suffer only 1 wounded soldier during the assault on Toulon Harbor. And there you have it. The French sink their own navy. Today on The Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to The Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on The Daily Dose, the Great London Smog of 1952. Beginning on December 5th, 1952, and lasting for the next 5 miserable days, Londoners choked in a dense blanket of smog that killed many and sickened many more. Known as pea soupers, London had suffered smog events since the 13th century, reaching a peak in the 1600s, but the Great Smog of 1952 is still considered the worst air pollution event in the history of the United Kingdom. The incident would trigger a significant increase in environmental research, government regulation, and the public's awareness of the relationship between air quality and health. Caused by a vicious cold snap that forced Londoners to burn more coal than usual, the increase in air pollution combined with an anti-cyclone weather pattern that brought any chance of a freshening breeze to a standstill. To make matters worse, post-war domestic coal consumption in the UK tended to be of the relatively low-grade, sulfurous kind, since the better quality or hard coals such as anthracite were exported out of the country to help pay down the nation's debt caused by the Second World War. As a result, the cheaper burning coal increased the amount of sulfur dioxide emitting from coal-burning power plants such as the Battersea Power Station, filling the air with dense particulates of hydrochloric acid, fluorine, sulfur dioxide, and sulfuric acid. Once visibility had reduced to under 10 feet, the London Underground was forced to shut down, along with basic services such as ambulance response and garbage collection. Concert halls and movie theaters were shuttered, along with all outdoor sporting events. The blanket of dense smog even penetrated through closed doors and windows, invading homes and businesses, leaving Londoners helpless to get away from the choking smog. Walking at night became a near impossibility, since the fluorescent streetlights of the time were made useless by the oppressive air. In the end, the Great London Smog took the lives of 6,000 to 12,000 Londoners, while badly sickening as many as 100,000 more. On the 9th of December, a welcoming breeze picked up and blew the smog out to sea, letting Londoners breathe easy again for the first time in days. And there you have it, the Great London Smog of 1952. Today on The Daily Dose. Today on The Daily Dose, the Japanese holdouts of World War II. Of the more than 6 million men who fought in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II, given the remote nature of many South Pacific battlefields, some soldiers failed to get the memo that the war had ended on August 15, 1945. Japanese holdouts either doubted the veracity of the formal surrender of Japan or simply failed to receive any form of communication that their war against the Allies had been lost. For instance, on January 1, 1946, 20 Japanese soldiers hiding in a tunnel on Corregidor Island surrendered to U.S. servicemen after learning the war had ended from a newspaper they found while collecting fresh water. In late March of 1947, Lieutenant Ai Yamaguchi and his corps of 33 soldiers emerged on Peleliu to attack a U.S. Marine Corps detachment stationed on the island, believing the war was still underway. Reinforcements were sent in, along with a Japanese admiral who was able to convince the men that the war was finally over. Notable holdouts continued to surrender into the 1950s and 60s, including Private Bunzo Minagawa, who held out on Guam until May 1960, and Sergeant Masashi Ito, Minagawa's superior, who surrendered days later on May 23, 1960, almost 15 years after Japan's formal surrender. Miraculously, some Japanese servicemen continued the fight into the 1970s, including Sergeant Shoichi Yoko, who served under Masashi Ito when he was finally captured on Guam. In October of 1972, Private First Class Kenichi Kozuka held out with Lieutenant Onoda for 28 years, until he was killed in a shootout with Philippine police. In March of 1974, a full 29 years after the end of the war, Lieutenant Hiro Onoda surrendered on Lubang after holding out on the island since December of 1944, refusing to surrender until he was relieved of duty by his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had flown to Lubang to formally relieve Onoda. And last but not least, Private Teru Nagamura was discovered by the Indonesian Air Force on Morotai, surrendering to a search party on December 18, 1974, a full 29 years, 3 months, and 16 days after the Japanese instrument of surrender was signed. Now that's a committed patriot. And there you have it, the Japanese holdouts of World War II, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Battle of Britain. After the Germans had rapidly overwhelmed France and the Low Countries of Europe, the Nazis set their sights on the overthrow of Great Britain. Heralded as the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces, the Battle of Britain ignited on July 10, 1940, before terrorizing the British for the next nearly 4 months to come. Fought between the German Luftwaffe, the British Royal Air Force, and the British Navy's Fleet Air Army, Hitler's primary objective for the campaign was to compel Britain to agree to a negotiated peace settlement, targeting coastal shipping convoys, ports, and shipping centers such as Portsmouth. On August 1st, the Luftwaffe was directed to achieve air superiority over the RAF, with the aim of incapacitating the RAF Fighter Command. 12 days later, it shifted their attacks to RAF airfields and infrastructure, which included the attempted destruction of British aircraft production facilities. After both German objectives failed, the Nazis shifted their focus to terror bombing raids over British cities, hoping that the resultant public outcry and political pressure would force politicians to capitulate. On July 16, 1940, Hitler ordered that preparations be made for Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned amphibious and airborne assault on Great Britain. In September, however, the RAF Bomber Command disrupted the Nazis' invasion plans during a series of punishing night raids on a flotilla of converted barges being outfitted for the coastal invasion of Britain. Combined with the Luftwaffe's failure to gain air superiority over the Brits, Hitler abruptly canceled all plans for Operation Sea Lion. Historian Stephen Bungay cited Germany's failure to destroy Britain's air defenses as the first major German defeat in World War II, while injecting a crucial turning point in the conflict in Europe. The Battle of Britain takes its name from a speech given by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to the House of Commons on June 18, 1940, when he said, "When General Weygand called the Battle of France over, I suspect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." The Battle of Britain would see 1,964 airmen casualties for the British, while the Germans suffered casualties of 4,245. 14,286 British civilians were killed during the 4-month running campaign, while an additional 20,325 British civilians were wounded. Despite these egregious losses, the victory in favor of Britain provided an enormous morale boost for the nation, emboldening their confidence that they could and would successfully defend themselves from Nazi aggression. And there you have it, the Battle of Britain, today in the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Chernobyl suffers a catastrophic meltdown. In 1986, the first word that something was seriously wrong came from a power plant in eastern Sweden when workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation on their bodies. Although the levels were not high enough to harm humans, the plant was shut down as a precaution until authorities could get a handle on the source. In a cascading domino aftermath, similar reports of high radiation began pouring in from all over Scandinavia, leading to the conclusion that the problem lay elsewhere, to the east in the Soviet Union. When media containment was no longer possible, Soviet officials belatedly confirmed that a catastrophic nuclear meltdown had occurred in the number 4 reactor at Chernobyl, not far from the Ukrainian city of Kiev. Denmark reported a 5 times increase in radiation levels, while Finland clocked in at 6. Radiation levels in Norway rose 50%, while Sweden's levels rose into the illegal category. The accident began during an electrical power outage safety test on Chernobyl's number 4 reactor, designed to ensure that interim water circulation measures could sufficiently cool the reactor's core until backup electrical generators could be brought online. During the planned shutdown, power levels unexpectedly dropped to 0, which combined with reactor design flaws, lack of operating protocols, and worker fatigue to set off an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction or meltdown. The subsequent steam explosion and reactor core fire released a deadly yet invisible plume of radioactive fallout, 70% of which fell on nearby Belarus. A 6-mile exclusion zone was created 36 hours after the accident, forcing nearly 50,000 people to be evacuated from the nearby city of Pripyat. Shortly thereafter, the exclusion radius was further expanded to 19 miles, forcing an additional 68,000 people to be relocated elsewhere in the Soviet Union. By the end of 1986, a sarcophagus had been built around the exploded reactor, involving 500,000 at-risk workers at an estimated cost of $68 billion in today's currency. The radiation fallout contaminated water supplies, agricultural lands, and animal herd stocks throughout Belarus and Scandinavia, forcing farmers to fallow crops for several years to come. Cancer rates rose precipitously in the affected areas, pinning some medical estimates regarding resultant cancer deaths at 16,000 innocent lives. And there you have it. Chernobyl suffers a catastrophic meltdown. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the Hungarian uprising of 1956. After suffering egregious losses to the Germans in both world wars, after the Huns' second defeat in 1945, the Soviet Union imposed their will over their eastern satellite bloc countries in an effort to buffer Mother Russia from future Germanic aggression. Fed up by communist shortages and Soviet-imposed policies, on October 23, 1956, student protesters marched through central Budapest to the Hungarian Parliament building. Quickly detained by Soviet-backed police, when protesters outside the Parliament building called for the students' release, they were fired upon by the State Security Police, or AVO as they were known. After the dead were draped in Hungarian flags and paraded through the streets of Budapest, thousands of Hungarians organized into militias and went to war against the AVO in an invasion of Soviet troops. During the revolt, AVO members and local leaders sympathetic to Soviet rule were captured and lynched, while former political prisoners were released and armed for the fight. After Hungary's initial victory over the Soviets, a sense of liberation and freedom from communist oppression swept through the country. By the end of October, fighting had almost ceased, and days of tranquil normality began to return. A new government was hastily formed behind revolutionary leader Emre Nagy, who quickly disbanded AVO while pledging to re-establish free elections. With growing unrest in several other Eastern Bloc satellite countries, desperate Soviet leaders needed to set an example. And after rumors began to circulate that Nagy intended to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European military alliance solely controlled by the Soviet Union, on Thursday, November the 4th, Soviet tanks and troops poured back across the Hungarian border, intending to crush the rebellion once and for all. This time, the battle would prove to be bloody and one-sided, for wherever belligerents were discovered, entire buildings were brought down to swiftly end pockets of resistance. While there were diplomatic protests from the free capitalist West, the world looked on in muted silence as the Soviets reimposed their will over Hungary. While Nagy fled to the Yugoslav embassy in search of asylum, he was later arrested by Soviet authorities, and like hundreds of other prominent revolutionaries, Nagy was summarily executed after a mock show trial. During the weeks that followed, 200,000 Hungarians fled the country, while thousands more were arrested and sent to labor camps. Over 2,500 Hungarians and 700 Soviet troops were killed during the uprising, forcing a repressed population back into obedient silence, until the Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991. And there you have it, the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. Today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube, or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, the Berlin airlift. After Berlin fell to the Russians in May of 1945, Germany lay powerless as the victorious Allies carved up the nation into 4 zones of occupation, including the 4 control zone sectors in Berlin, which as a whole lay in the Soviet sector. 3 years later, another battle would be fought in Berlin, this time a battle of political ideology, as well as the first significant chapter in the 43-year-long Cold War. For the first 2 months after the surrender of Germany, the Russians were the sole occupiers of Berlin, who made sincere strides to get the bombed-out and war-weary citizens of Berlin back on their feet again. On July 1, 1945, American, French, and British garrisons moved into their sectors of the city, and while comradeship between the victors of World War II appeared amicable at first, conflict soon began to erode trust between the Soviets and the Western powers. The Russians proposed that the biggest socialist party of Germany should combine with the Communist Party, but the socialists in the Western sector insisted on putting the issue to a vote, suspecting that unity with the Communists would eventually lead to unity under the Communists. The majority vote turned away from the Soviets, and since the Soviets had suffered egregious losses to German aggression in both world wars, Stalin was determined to turn Eastern Europe into a buffer zone to protect Russia from future Aryan hostilities. After the United States, France, and Britain combined their sectors of Germany to create a separate Western state, the days of participation between the Soviets and Western powers rapidly disintegrated. When the Western powers replaced the grossly inflated German currency with the Deutschmark, a currency that was only valid in West Germany, the first major act of the Cold War was officially on. On June 24, 1948, the Russians stopped all rail service into and out of West Berlin, while on August 24th, Autobahn and canal links were also blockaded, with the hope of starving Western powers out of Germany once and for all. In response, American and British air crews, along with 5 other lesser-involved Allied powers, began airlifting supplies for the 2 million Germans living in West Berlin, a monumental supply line feat that lasted until the Soviets ended their blockade on September 30th, 1949. While the original plan called for 3,476 tons of supplies delivered daily, by the spring of 1949, that number would peak at 12,941 daily tons of coal and inbound essentials. The U.S. Air Force delivered 1,783,573 tons of supplies, while the RAF delivered 541,937 tons. The Berlin airlift flew over 92 million miles, while at the height of the operation, one cargo plane landed in West Berlin every 30 seconds. The Berlin blockade served to highlight the competing ideological visions for post-war Europe, while playing a major role in drawing West Germany into NATO's orbit several years later in 1955. And there you have it, the Berlin airlift, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Catherine the Great. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst on May 2, 1729, Catherine the Great was Empress of Russia from 1762 until her death in 1796, giving her the distinction as Russia's longest ruling female leader. Coming to power following a coup d'etat that overthrew her husband, Tsar Peter III, under her reign, Russia grew from near third world obscurity to one of the greatest powers in all of Europe. Proving the age-old adage that an angry wife can be detrimental to a husband's health, Catherine's marriage to Tsar Peter III proved to be a raging disaster from the start. When Catherine became pregnant with her second child, Anna, due to various rumors of Catherine's promiscuity, Peter rejected his biological connection to the child, proclaiming that Anna should go to the devil. Catherine wrote in her diary that I used to say to myself that happiness and misery depend on ourselves, and to improve her sense of happiness, she conspired with other political opponents to Tsar Peter, leading to his assassination on July 8, 1762. While his assassins remain unclear, after an autopsy, Peter's official cause of death was labeled a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplexy stroke. Once in power, Catherine aligned herself with noble strongmen and generals alike, rapidly expanding the Russian Empire by conquest and diplomacy. In the south, the Crimean Khaganate was crushed following victories over the Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish Wars, followed by the colonization of the Novorossiya territories along the coast of the Black and Azov Seas. A great admirer of the Enlightenment and Peter the Great, Catherine continued to modernize Russia along Western European standards, including the foundation of the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-funded university-level institution for women in Europe, as well as the Moscow Orphanage for Disadvantaged Children and the Bolshoi Theater. She also established the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, sending out Soviets or art collectors to acquire famous works of art throughout Europe and the world. Today, the Hermitage represents the second largest art museum in the world, which celebrates its founding each year on December 7th, with ceremonies known as St. Catherine's Day. And there you have it, Catherine the Great, today in the Daily Dose. Today in the Daily Dose, Cahill's Crossing, the most dangerous transit in the world. Located in the remote Northern Territory of Australia, Cahill's Crossing is a frequently flooded river transit point, which is notorious for vehicles getting washed off the submerged roadway, especially during the rainy season. While being swept away seems bad enough, that alone isn't what makes the crossing so dangerous. Park rangers have counted as many as 120 saltwater crocodiles in a 6-mile stretch of river leading up to Cahill's Crossing, where they lay in wait near the submerged roadway, seeking out the dense populations of fish that congregate near the crossing during tidal shifts. This phenomenon alone makes Cahill's Crossing an infamous feeding ground for saltwater crocs, and one of the most dangerous passageways on the continent for impatient drivers unwilling to wait out high tides. The river that Cahill's Crossing spans can go from a gentle muddy trickle to a deep and powerful torrent, ready to sweep away any vehicle that dares to make an ill-timed passage. Each year, dozens of drivers attempt to make it across the submerged roadway during high tides, finding themselves washed away into the croc-infested waters. Once stranded, a driver must exit their vehicle in an effort to winch themselves out of their predicament, forcing them to run a crocodile gauntlet in order to get their winch cables secured to sturdy objects on the shoreline. Over the years, there has been a multitude of fatalities when careless hikers have attempted to tackle the crossing on foot, while many more have been lost to hungry crocs while fishing at the river's edge. One of the world's leading experts on crocodiles, Graham Webb, says that for every crocodile you can see, there are 10 others that you can't, making Cahill's Crossing one of the most dangerous transit points in the world. And there you have it, Cahill's Crossing, serving hot meals for hungry crocodiles. Today in the Daily Dose. Today in the Daily Dose, the Hitler Youth of Nazi Germany. In the early 20th century, Germany had for many years a history of youth organizations, some linked to a particular church or political party, while others were staunchly non-sectarian. Most of these groups held a common theme of friendship and healthy social engagement, and while many of these organizations united and flourished based on the strength of their leadership, by far the most predominant and lasting of these organizations was the Hitler Youth. The Nazi Party had its roots in the infant German Workers' Party, which Adolf Hitler reluctantly joined in 1919. By 1921, the organization had morphed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, with Hitler as its leader. In the summer of 1921, an 18-year-old former National German Youth leader, Gustav Adolf Link, applied for membership with the NSDAP, but was denied due to his age. Link persisted in his bid to join the organization, and in 1922, the Youth League of the NSDAP had been formed under his leadership. Membership was for Aryan German males only between the ages of 14 and 18 years, while foreigners and Jews were vehemently disallowed. When Link was ousted in 1926 for financial improprieties, the paramilitary group was renamed the Hitler Youth, roughly 1 year after the foundation of the Nazi Party. Members of the Hitler Youth were seen by most Germans as a way to ensure the future of Nazi ideology, including anti-Semitic racism and the belief in Aryan supremacy among the races of men. Training included hiking and camping, as well as weapons training, assault course circuits, and basic military boot camp preparation. The aim was to instill in German youth the motivation that would enable its members to fight faithfully for the Nazi cause, should Germany ever see the need to go to war. Emphasizing physical fitness and military training over academic pursuit, the principles of self-sacrifice were instilled in each and every member. Emphasizing the Nazi Party over secular practices, Hitler Youth were used to break up church gatherings and religious youth groups, while interfering with church attendance any chance they could get. While the educational and training goals of the Hitler Youth attempted to undermine the values of the traditional elitist structures of German society, their training also aimed at obliterating the distinctions between the classes, replacing class stratifications with the political goals of Hitler's totalitarian dictatorship. And there you have it, the Hitler Youth of Nazi Germany, today in the Daily Dose. Today in the Daily Dose, the Yalta Conference and the fate of post-war Europe. Known as the Crimea Conference, or more popularly the Yalta Conference, the big three Allied leaders came together at a palace in the Black Sea resort town of Yalta to determine the post-war fate of Europe. Arriving on the 4th of February, 1945, and lasting for the next 7 days, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met at Levadia Palace to shape a post-war peace that represented not just a collective security order, but a plan to give self-determination to the liberated peoples of post-Nazi occupied Europe. Marking the third wartime meeting between the big three, by the time of the Yalta Conference, the Allies had liberated all of France and Belgium, with fighting now closing in on the western border of Germany, while in the east, Soviet forces were less than 40 miles from Berlin, having already pushed the Germans out of Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. During the talks, Stalin agreed to enter the Pacific War against Japan within 3 months after the fall of Germany, and since the Russians had suffered egregious losses to German aggression in both world wars, the group agreed that Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, the historical corridors for forces attempting to invade Russia, would remain in the Soviet sphere as a security buffer for a war-weary Soviet nation. The conference further set the boundaries for post-war occupation zones in Germany, including one for each 3 principal Allied nations attending the conference, along with a 4th zone for France, whose leader Charles de Gaulle was snubbed from the meeting, a diplomatic slight that caused a deep and lasting resentment in the French leader. Despite the fact that Berlin resided in the Soviet zone, the city was further divided into 4 zones of occupation, again by the principal Allied nations. A declaration of liberated Europe was also created by the Big Three, which encouraged the people of Europe to create democratic institutions of their own design and to hold free elections for governments responsive to the will of the people. And there you have it, the Yalta Conference and the fate of post-war Europe. Today on The Daily Dose, get your nerd on with The Daily Dose and learn something new every day. Subscribe to The Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on The Daily Dose, the prophecies of Nostradamus. While most academics dismiss the prophecies of Nostradamus as intentional mistranslations of his 1555 publication of Les Prophéties, others have found his prophecies regarding future events to be numbingly close to the truth. A physician and astrologer by trade, his book of 942 poetic quatrains has long captivated the world. For instance, one of his prophecies regarding 9/11 reads, "Earth-shaking fire from the center of the earth shall cause tremors around the new city. 2 great rocks will war for a long time. Then Arethusa will redden a new river." Another of his poems relating to 9/11 reads, "2 steel birds shall fall from the sky on the metropolis. The sky will burn at 40 degrees latitude," which in truth turns out to be the exact latitude for New York City. Among Nostradamus's most talked about prophecies include the Great London Fire of 1666, the French Revolution, the rise of both Napoleon Bonaparte and later Adolf Hitler, the Apollo moon landings, and the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. He also prophesied the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, both World War I and World War II, and the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While academics insist that the prophecies of Nostradamus are little more than retroactive clairvoyant interpretations of his quatrains, plenty others maintain that Nostradamus was and remains one of the most gifted seers of all time. And there you have it, the prophecies of Nostradamus. Today on The Daily Dose. Today on The Daily Dose, the Opium Wars. In earlier times, opium was perceived in China as a relatively harmless medicine, but a new practice arose in the 18th century of smoking opium recreationally, which vastly increased demand while leading to the widespread addiction of the Chinese population. In an attempt to curb the growing problem, Chinese Qing dynasty emperors drafted a succession of laws from 1729 to 1831, which made the drug illegal, yet imports continued to grow as smugglers and corrupt officials gorged on massive profits. Before the First Opium War, China enjoyed a favorable trade balance with Europe, selling porcelains, silk, and tea in exchange for silver. In the late 18th century, however, the British East India Company expanded cultivation of opium in its Indian Bengal territory, selling it to private traders who transported it into China and passed it on to Chinese smugglers. By 1787, the company was sending 4,000 chests of the drug annually into China, each containing 170 pounds of opium, creating a nation of addicts which the Qing dynasty sought to eradicate. By 1833, opium trafficking into China had soared to 30,000 chests a year. As a result, two wars waged between the Qing dynasty and the Western powers using the Chinese populace as a profit generator. The first Opium War was fought from 1839 to 1842 between the Qing dynasty and Great Britain, while the second was fought between the Qing dynasty, Great Britain, France, and Russia from 1856 to 1860. In each war, European soldiers and naval assets employed superior military techniques to defeat Qing belligerents, compelling the Chinese to grant favorable tariffs, trade concessions, and territory, including the transfer of Hong Kong to Great Britain. The two wars resulted in the Treaty of Tientsin on June 26, 1858, forcing China to pay reparations for the expenses of both wars, while expanding the number of ports open to European commerce. The treaty also legalized the opium trade, granting foreign traders and missionaries full rights to travel freely within China. And there you have it. Greed and substance abuse wins the opium wars. Today on the Daily Dose. Today in the Daily Dose, the Potsdam Declaration, the biggest bluff in World War II history. While the objective of the Potsdam Conference of 1945 offered the chance for the Big Three Allied leaders to discuss the fate of post-war Europe, the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945, was an intentionally ambiguous demand for Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. Until newly minted U.S. President Harry S. Truman made his late appearance to the conference at the insistence of the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. A ground invasion plan of Japan, known as Operation Downfall, had been widely discussed by Allied leaders, even though General Douglas MacArthur's own staff had resigned itself to an estimated 31,000 Allied casualties in the first month of combat alone. The Joint Chiefs were even more pessimistic, speculating that any successful invasion of Japan would come with an Allied death toll upwards of 500,000 lives. Ominously, the U.S. War Department had already ordered 500,000 Purple Heart medals in advance of the anticipated invasion. Instead, arriving to the meeting with news of a successful nuclear detonation at Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range in New Mexico, Truman confided to the other leaders that the U.S. had 2 ready nuclear bombs for deployment. After absorbing the news, the leaders landed on a strategy which rested on 4 sequential elements: the issuance of an ultimatum of surrender to Japan, which, if unheeded, would prompt the Americans to drop one of their nuclear bombs on a major Japanese city. Next would come the public declaration of war upon Japan by the USSR, followed by more nuclear strikes on Japan until the empire finally capitulated. The strategy was a bold-faced bluff, since the US had only 2 working nuclear bombs at the time, with a substantial lag time before any additional bombs could be made ready. On August 6, 1945, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island with a bomb nicknamed Little Boy in its bomb bay hold. Hiroshima was the primary target, with Kokura and Nagasaki as backup alternatives. The nuclear weapon was armed shortly before arriving over the target, which was then dropped and detonated at an altitude of 1,750 feet, instantly destroying a 4.7 square mile area while killing an estimated 80,000 people. When Japan failed to capitulate, on August 9th, America's second nuclear bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, while a third bomb was expected by August 19th. 4 days before delivery, Japanese Emperor Hirohito formally announced the surrender of Japan. And there you have it, the big bluff that ended World War II. Today in the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the historical upside to human pandemics. While epidemics have ravaged human societies throughout recorded history, global health challenges have also sparked progress in culture, economics, and civilization, ultimately changing the lives of the survivors for the better. For instance, after the massive losses to serfdom labor resulting from the Black Death of 1347, agricultural workers were able to demand better pay and working conditions from their manorial lords. In urban areas following the plague, authorities became more aware of the importance of public sanitation in curbing pandemics, spawning the precursors to modern concepts of public health. In 1793, following a yellow fever epidemic that swept through Philadelphia, then the largest city in America and the nation's temporary capital, the pandemic caused sweeping changes by the Founding Fathers. Home to such notables as George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, the yellow fever epidemic convinced them that the social, economic, and political health of the nation was inextricably tied up with public health, leading to vast improvements in both policy and law. In the 1920s, following the heavy losses to the flu pandemic of 1918, governments around the world embraced new concepts of preventative and socialized medicine, putting in place centralized healthcare systems that exist to this day. While in the United States, employer-based healthcare insurance plans were put in place for the first time in the nation's history. The flu pandemic of 1918 also inspired physicians and scientists to focus on the occupational and social conditions that promoted illness, not only to cure the illness in question, but to install epidemiological practices to further study the patterns, causes, and effects of infectious disease transmission. The repeatable nature of pandemics has also led to increased vaccination against recurrent diseases such as measles, malaria, and polio, to name just a few. Following the flu pandemic of 1918, the concept of social distancing further influenced residential building design, prompting legislation by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s that required all apartments to have fire escapes, wider hallways, and separate bathrooms. Social distancing also found its way into fashion when the advent of hoop-skirt dresses provided a much-needed distancing tactic from men. And there you have it, the historical upside to human pandemics. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the 7 natural wonders of the world. The 7 Natural Wonders is an organization which was created to protect and promote the natural wonders of the world. Leading off the list is the Aurora Borealis, or Northern Lights, which can best be seen in high-latitude regions such as northern Canada, Alaska, and Scandinavia. Next on the list is the Grand Canyon, which was carved out by the Colorado River in Arizona. The Grand Canyon is 277 miles long and at some points as much as 18 miles wide, with a maximum depth of 6,093 feet. Carved out by nearly 2 billion years of geologic history, the canyon is a must-see for any intrepid traveler. Paricutin takes 3rd place on the list, despite its remote location in Michoacan, Mexico, roughly 200 miles west of Mexico City. The volcano erupted quite suddenly from the cornfield of local farmer Dionisio Pulido in 1943, attracting both popular and scientific attention. When the volcano erupted, it took the lives of 3 people and forced the permanent evacuation of 2 towns. Victoria Falls is 4th on the list, which can best be viewed from Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe or Livingstone in Zambia. Helicopter tours and microlight tours make the falls a sight to be seen and felt in person, although the rainy season can be uncomfortable, which runs from late November through early April. Mount Everest is 5th on the list, and while mountaineers consider this 29,029-foot mountain To be the highest place on Earth, the real winner for that distinction belongs to Mauna Kea in Hawaii. The Great Barrier Reef holds 6th place on the Natural Wonders list, which is made up of over 900 islands and nearly 3,000 separate and independent reefs. Sustaining one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world, visitors can snorkel or scuba dive the reefs to take in a dizzying array of colorful fish, corals, and exotic marine life. Last but not least is the harbor of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, which is surrounded by granite mountains and pinnacles, including Sugarloaf Mountain, Corcovado Peak, and Tejuca Hills, making the 7 wonders of the world a natural bucket list for adventure seekers everywhere. And there you have it, the 7 wonders of the world, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today in the Daily Dose, the Ottoman Empire. At its height of power, the Ottoman Empire controlled much of southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa between the 14th and early 20th centuries. Founded at the end of the 13th century in northwestern Anatolia by the Turkoman tribal leader Osman I, and while the dynasty was Turkish in origin, it was Persianized in terms of language, culture, literature, and habits. After 1354, the Ottomans crossed into Europe by invading and controlling the Balkans, becoming a transcontinental empire for the first time in its lengthy existence. Roughly 100 years later, the Ottomans ended the Byzantine Empire during the conquest of Constantinople, which was successfully invaded by Mehmed the Conqueror. Under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire reached its high-water years of power, becoming a multinational, multilingual empire that controlled most of southeastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Asia, parts of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. With Constantinople as its capital, now present-day Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire stood as the primary trading vector between the Eastern and Western worlds for nearly 6 centuries. During a protracted period of peace from 1740 to 1768, however, the Ottoman military fell behind that of their European rivals, which included the Habsburg and Russian empires, which brought about near-crushing military defeats during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The string of defeats ushered in a period of reformation and modernization known as the Tanzimat, which served to increase its power base and organization, despite suffering further territorial losses in the Balkans. With the 1913 coup d'etat bringing the nationalistic Committee of Union and Progress to power, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and the Axis powers. During the First World War, internal dissent led to the Arab Revolt, which further inspired genocidal acts against the Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks by the Ottoman government. The empire's defeat and occupation in the aftermath of World War I resulted in the empire's partitioning of the Middle East, which was divided between the United Kingdom and France. Eventually, Allied occupation would lead to the successful Turkish War of Independence, which crushed the last vestiges of a once great empire, leading to the emergence of the Republic of Turkey in its aftermath. And there you have it, the Ottoman Empire, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Ernest Shackleton survives the South Pole. Sailing from South Georgia Island for Antarctica on December 5, 1914, 27 men set out for the South Pole, hoping to establish a base on Antarctica's Weddell seacoast. 2 days later, the HMS Endurance entered the pack ice standing guard around the Antarctic continent, poking and prodding its way through leads in the ice until a January 18th northerly gale trapped the ship for the next 10 months to come. In the words of crewman Thomas Ord-Lees, the Endurance became frozen like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. Finally, on October 27, 1915, a new wave of pressure rippled across the ice, lifting the ship's stern and tearing off its rudder and keel, effectively crushing the ship's hull. Led by famed Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, after salvaging what they could from the doomed ship, the crew's initial plan was to march across the ice toward land, but that was abandoned after the men managed just 7.5 miles in 7 days. Camping on the ice until conditions improved, slowly and steadily their ice floe drifted farther to the north, until on April 7, 1916, the snow-capped peaks of Clarence and Elephant Islands came into view. 2 days later, their ice raft broke apart, forcing the men to row in frigid conditions until they clambered ashore on Elephant Island. It would be the first time the men stood on dry land since leaving South Georgia 497 days earlier. After 9 days of rest and recuperation, Shackleton and 5 others set out in one of Endurance's salvaged lifeboats, the James Caird, facing off with a 16-day voyage through monstrous swells and angry winds, bailing water and beating ice off the sails as they ventured 800 miles back to South Georgia Island. Blown off course by fearsome winds, Shackleton and 2 others set off on foot, climbing over mountains and sliding down glacier fields for 30 hours until they could reach help at the whaling station where they first departed. Meanwhile, the remaining crew hunkered down on Elephant Island, employing additional salvaged lifeboats to create what they called the Snuggery, surviving the bitter cold with ever-diminishing hopes of being rescued. After 2 failed attempts to navigate through the floes of pack ice, Shackleton procured a 3rd ship, the Yelcho, and on August 30th, 1916, the saga of the Endurance and her crew came to an end. The men on the island were settling down to a lunch of boiled seal's backbone when they spied the Yelcho just offshore. It had been 128 days since the James Caird had departed for help, ending 20 months of gutsy survival since the misadventure of the Endurance first began. And there you have it. Ernest Shackleton survives the South Pole. Today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, the shot heard round the world. Lifted from the opening stanza of Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1837 poem entitled Concord Hymn, the shot heard round the world is a phrase that refers to the opening exchanges during the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, which set off the American Revolution and ultimately led to the creation of the United States of America. Emerson's phrase set off years of open debate between the Massachusetts towns where the battles unfolded, both towns maintaining that the first shot of the Revolutionary War happened directly in their backyard. While the first shots were fired early on April 19th at the Battle of Lexington, taking the lives of 8 patriots and wounding 1 British soldier, the events at Lexington remain confused and contradictory at best. The North Bridge skirmish at Concord, however, saw the first shots fired by Americans acting under orders, resulting in the first British fatalities and the first British retreat. When the Marquis de Lafayette visited the 2 towns in 1824, Lexington's civic leaders welcomed him to the birthplace of American liberty, while leaders in Concord called their town the place of first forcible resistance to British overrule. President Ulysses S. Grant considered avoiding the 1875 centennial celebrations in the area to evade the issue, and while he ultimately attended, the debate simmers on in the region even to this day. The phrase shot heard round the world has also attached itself to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, which has long been considered the most immediate ignition point responsible for World War I. Inspired by a Serbian military conspiracy, Serbian Gavrilo Princip was one of 6 assassins gunning for Ferdinand that day, firing 2 shots into the limousine carrying the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Both the Archduke and his wife Sophie were murdered, triggering an avalanche of military alliances between countries that quickly escalated into the war to end all wars. And there you have it, the shot heard round the world, today in the Daily Dose. Today in the Daily Dose, Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. In ancient Greek, the word Mesopotamia means between 2 rivers, which is exactly where Mesopotamian life, culture, and progress flourished for 6,000 years. Part of the Fertile Crescent, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, spans modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, the southeastern region of Turkey, and the western fringes of Iran. Even at its peak existence, Mesopotamia was less unified than other ancient civilizations such as Egypt or Greece, embodying a latticework of different cultures that loosely shared the same gods and attitudes toward women. It was home to some of the very first empires in human history, including the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian sovereignties. The region of Sumer comprised the southeastern part of Mesopotamia, and in the 4th millennium BCE, the Sumerians, as the locals were known, struck upon 2 major developments which forever handed the region the honor of being known as the cradle of civilization. First was the development of agriculture, irrigation, and animal husbandry, which in turn created the modern concept of the city-state. The region is further credited with the invention of the wheel, the early distillation of beer and wine, the invention of the chariot, the demarcation of time in hours, minutes, and seconds, along with the development of sophisticated weaponry and advanced warfare techniques. As Fertile Crescent merchants began trading with outside communities, the Mesopotamians invented writing to aid in long-distance communication, which in turn prompted urbanization and the birth of cities. Schools in Mesopotamia were numerous, routinely teaching astrology, law, medicine, religion, reading, and writing. In Mesopotamia, women were nearly equal to men, allowing them to file for divorce, own land, and own their own businesses. Combined with an abundance of food and a growing string of successful city-states, Mesopotamia's ever-burgeoning population began to spread out across the globe in search of additional fertile lands and opportunity, spreading humanity throughout the world as the Fertile Crescent itself became desert-like due to climate change. Today, only 10% of the Fertile Crescent's once viable ecosystem remains, making the Fertile Crescent an important yet temporary lifeboat for the migration of humans across the globe. And there you have it, Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. Today on the Daily Dose, get your nerd on with the Daily Dose and learn something new every day. Subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.